course and principal writer for the industry-leading blog Mike on Traffic. He is a licensed professional engineer and certified professional traffic operations engineer. And Bryant is the vice president of SPAC Enterprise and is also a licensed PE and certified PTOE. Now we'll get to the poll here in a minute. So most of you have answered, and what we have is 54% are consultant, 36% are city staff, and 10% are other. The residential speed limit in your jurisdiction, 57% is 25. 57 is 25, and 30 miles per hour for 42% of you are still voting. Where are you? Majority of you are in the North Midwest at 31%, tied with the East Coast representing. Then we have the South at 17%, West Coast at 14%, and non-US at 8%. Welcome. Thank you for joining us if you're outside the US. And only 15% of you would be willing to pay the $10 for the 0.5 ECU equivalent or PhD. Now, the SPAC Enterprise core purpose is to improve transportation globally. Both Mike and Bryant take this purpose to heart and work on many research projects each year. In addition to being just generally interesting work, these projects have helped drive a better understanding of traffic and transportation, as well as provide concrete benefits for the cities and the engineers and others who work with them. Recent examples would include the stop sign compliance, drive-through queues for various businesses, and the effectiveness of travel demand management plan. And today's webinar reflects one of those research projects. Please, Mike and Brian, take it away.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, thanks, Paul. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
And yeah, welcome to everyone, and particularly those outside the US who are probably in a different time zone, and we may be keeping you up late or very early morning. But it's interesting to see a nice spread of people around. That's encouraging and very humbling.
Yeah, and we will be talking miles per hour. We assume you can do the conversion over to kilometers per hour.
All right, so let's get started then. We're talking residential roads today, and this is a common, or can become a common issue in many cities because it's generally the source of a lot of complaints.
Yeah, and as anyone who works in a city knows, as I became painfully aware when I became traffic engineer for Maple Grove many years ago, the kind of traffic engineering city engineers department is very much a complaint center centered around speeding and stop sign requests. So this is at the heart of what goes on in many city engineering departments.
So as we alluded to, Minnesota is a 30 mile per hour state, and there is a big debate going on in our state right now as to whether we should lower that to 25 miles per hour. So the statutory speed for residential roads is 30. Should we change that to 25?
Yeah, and there's proponents, not just residents who live along a street are pushing for that, but also the bicycling community here is very much pushing for that as the world is becoming more multimodal and pedestrians too. And that leads to our next slide, which really at the heart of those debates is the slower the car is going, if it strikes a pedestrian or bicyclist, the greater chance of surviving that crash.
Yeah, you can see on the two charts we have, and here's a long website at the bottom. You can try to copy that later from the video when we send that back out. But this is an interactive graph from a couple years ago. I assume the data is still valid, even if it's not exact. And you can see, let me get my laser pointer here, but you can see on the one side we have 25 mile an hour. That's where our line is. And risk to all is about 12%, or that chances of being killed. And when you go to 30, that jumps up to 20%. So that's
more than a 50% jump on being killed by a car if you're a pedestrian or bicyclist. Difference between 25 and 30 miles an hour.
Yep, and so that is one of, like Mike said, one of the basis for people wanting to change our law to go to 25 mile an hour. All right, so to set us up get us all on the same footing as we start here, the MUTCD does have some speed limit guidance, and there are two ways that it is listed to set speed limits. The first one is statutorily. So this is the state or an authority, generally state law, setting a maximum speed to a particular class of road. So a freeway, a city street, as we're talking here, are residential roads.
And the next one is for the MUTCD. Well, maybe we should pause for those few folks who might not know. Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which is really the big specification book in the United States of traffic control. So signals, signs, those kinds of things. So it governs when we put in signs, where, what those signs say. So everything's uniform across the country. It'd be tough to have purple signs in one small jurisdiction. But so backing up here, so every state generally sets a law that sets speed limits on certain types of roads, but then also gives the ability to some jurisdictions somehow to alter those speed zones. And here in Minnesota, it's ultimately the commissioner of the state DOT. An engineering study has to be done underneath them, and then the commissioner can change the speed limits. But there is some wiggle room for city councils to jump in and do that as well.
Correct. But generally you have the two. You're either setting it, again, statutorily by state law or some city or town passed resolution, or by, we have it down as an altered speed zone. This is referring to those engineering studies. Generally, those go by the 85th percentile. So they take measurements of the speeds out there, see what most people are traveling at, round it to 5 in our case, miles per hour, and set that as the speed limit. So those are the two ways. For residential roads that we're talking about, they are generally set by state statutes. So, and we do want to point out there is some debate going on as to whether statutory speed limits are even correct in and of themselves. Are we arbitrarily setting a speed limit? And there's implications that go with that.
Yeah, we're not weighing in on that debate today.
Right. Let's leave
We're
that
just
one alone.
getting into some data.
There was a question on that where Philip was under the understanding that the MUTCD is a federal regulation and not a guidance. Is that part of that debate?
The MUTCD is federal regulation. Different sections have mandates versus guidance. So
I'd have to look back at the exact language to see whether this is a standard or whether is it a shall condition or a should. There's varying language to them. Yeah, but just in general, we wanted to just point out the two differences, and what we are talking about today is the statutory speed limits.
Okay.
All right, so with that base, talking about statutory speed limits, residential roads, as we mentioned, Minnesota is a 30-mile-per-hour state, and we saw some differences in our poll as to who was 30 or 25. For our purposes, our next door neighbor, Wisconsin, they are a 25-mile-an-hour. So we had our two states that we are lucky enough to have basically a test right next to each other.
Yeah.
Roughly similar types of drivers, roughly similar demographics, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so our process here was to reach out to friends and family, but family didn't have any data. But our friends, Reed Ronsky, city engineer over River Falls, got us a pile of data on residential streets, speed data, as well as the street widths associated with that speed data. And then over on the Minnesota side, which is very close to Wisconsin, city of Woodbury and Tony Kutsky in the engineering department got us data from the city of Woodbury. Contextually, Woodbury is very standard suburban community without a lot of on-street parking. River Falls is a college town to a degree, so there is more on-street parking, but kind of as you get outside the city to the outer limits, it's more suburban.
And so our process for this We didn't do any of the base level data, but we worked with these two, and they were, we were very happy they were willing to participate, and they provided us the speed data that they had already collected. So this was not driven by us. We just merely gathered the data in, and then we poured through the results and basically compared to see what we had.
So kind of at the high level summary statistics of what we found, River Falls got us less sites, but you can see based on the volumes, they were busier corridors. Woodbury got us about 3 times more data, but a little bit less volumes on those streets.
Mm-hmm.
Average speeds close to each other, as were 85th percentile speeds. Again, River Falls, Wisconsin, 25 miles per hour. Because that speed limit is set lower, they have a higher proportion of people on those roadways breaking the speed limit, breaking the law. So interesting findings.
Mm-hmm. So that's the top level. If we put everything together, that's what we found. But then part of our premise as we looked at this was the sign doesn't make as much of a difference as the width of the road does.
So this data leads to the conclusion that statutory or speed limit signs are irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
They're not impacting behavior. So then we tried to dive into maybe what's the next logical thing impacting behavior.
Right. And so if we go to our next table here, this is where we pulled those out by the road width. So we had roads from 28 to 42 feet wide. And we've highlighted what is generally considered a residential road. That's 32 feet. You've got your travel in each way, parking allowed on at least one side, could be both sides. But generally they're in that range. And then, but we had, from the data provided, we had that range of widths. And then we have, for this table, we put together what's that average 85th percentile. So if we just go down, if we start at Wisconsin, we can see it jumped around a little bit more, that 32 foot. I believe we only had a couple samples there, or 1 or 2. So that one, a little bit of an outlier, but you can see it kind of starts lower, generally moves up as you get into the 40, 42 foot range. The speeds have gone up. If we compare that to Minnesota, you can see a clear increase in the 85th percentile speeds as that width increases. And we start below 30, so the 28 foot roads, we were actually below the posted, or the statutory speed limit. And then as we got up to 42, we're well above it. Other thing that I would point out on this one is for the typical, really that 30 foot width, just again, how close the results were between them, even though 2 different speed limits.
Yeah. So from the traffic engineer's perspective, looking at the 85th percentile speed, a 30 to 32 foot wide road, a 30 mile an hour speed limit is about the appropriate decision.
If we were to do an engineering study on it, yes.
There was another question regarding the data. Did you look at average driveway spacing against speed by segment?
We'll get into everything we looked at. So
Yeah, there's
yeah. So let's hold those kinds of questions to the end because we got half a dozen different things we'll talk about.
Yep. All right, so this was just the basic table of results looking at those average 85th percentiles. The other thing we did, turning to this type, is put it into a graph and then put a trend line on it. So this is just linear. We put all the data in. The orange is for the 30 mile an hour. You can see we did have more sites than the blue, the 25. Then we put that line in, and just like we were saying, that the Minnesota, the 30 mile an hour, just a very clear linear correlation between the 85th percentile speed and the roadway width. For Wisconsin, it does go up, but it is a much flatter line.
Yeah, very gradual. Then we get into the average speeds and exactly the same trend lines.
Mm-hmm. So this was our attempt to look beyond the 85th. The 85th is obviously one measure that a lot of people look at. It's the percentage by which 85% of the drivers and below are at that speed or below.
Yeah.
Typical measure. So average speed, we're just looking at the midline. What do we got? Again, like Mike said, clear correlation, smaller, a little bit flatter for the 25. But again, they're both increasing as we go up in roadway width. And then our last one, we looked at it. What is that percentage of speeding versus the road width? So similar result, if we look at the 30 mile an hour, we have that clear line that goes up, roadway width goes up, more people are speeding, more people are over that statutory speed limit of 30. Interesting enough, for the 25 mile an hour sites, our line was slightly negative in this case, relatively flat. So for the 25, we had about the same amount of people speeding.
So conclusions, and I'll foreshadow here. In a couple slides, we'll get out to all the caveats and the kind of the more background in the data and how we got here. But kind of the conclusions, the first one is surprisingly in Minnesota with the 30 mile per hour speed limit, that our sites had lower speeds of the vehicles on those roads. So really indicating in the data that the speed limit doesn't really have much of an impact on what people are doing on the road.
Mm-hmm. Next one, like we saw in the table and in the graphs, that both had that speed increase with the width. So as we moved up from our 28 to 42 roadway widths, you could see a corresponding increase in those speeds. However,
that as roads get wider in Minnesota and it's more comfortable to drive, people quickly accelerate and are going faster and faster on those roads because it's comfortable. And I think having the speed limit a little bit higher gives the band of what people think is acceptable. It allows that to creep higher.
Mm-hmm. And then a final one on this is just we had closer results with what we classified as a typical residential roadway, those widths of 32 feet or less. So between the two sites, basically we had roughly similar 85th percentile on average speeds on those lower levels. So again, just showing that despite the difference in the statutory speed limit on these two sites, the measurements we take for speeds were roughly the same.
Yeah. So now we'll turn to all the caveats and kind of what was behind our study. So first of all, our study was a very non-scientific small sample size. So I wouldn't hang my hat on this in a public hearing. And this could quickly blossom into a PhD thesis project, in my opinion. But from our perspective, anyone who follows Mike on Traffic, some data is better than no data, always. So
yeah, it gives us a glimpse into what we think is happening, and it somewhat confirmed our theory that the sign or the statutory speed limit doesn't matter, that people are driving according to other factors.
Yes, and we would love any of the listeners out there, especially if you're working for a city, if you have a data set of speed data on your corridors in your city, we'd love to work with you to make this study more robust.
Our second caveat to it is obviously enforcement. So this data was given to us. We have no idea what type of enforcement may have occurred during the samples. The sample for each site that was given to us ranged from less than a day to 2 or 3 days of value. So there was, again, this was varying degrees on the data that was given to us. And we, along with that small sample size, we just don't know what might have been behind it. Did there happen to be patrols out there on one of the roads or more? We assume that it was pretty light. We assume there was nothing out of the ordinary, but we don't know for sure.
We don't know. And getting into the driveway question, we did not account for roadway geometry and try to classify terrain, hilliness. We didn't break in driveways per mile, sharp curves, horizontal curves. We didn't go down that path. Of course, a PhD level thesis should dig into all of those to see if there is nuances.
Again, we assume, and per the standards, as we put out for our equipment for the way count and that, you want to set it on a level straight stretch of road. You try to avoid driveways or other intersections where you have turning vehicles over your tubes. Obviously that impacts your data. So again, we assume everything was set up per the standards, but we don't know whether there was a curve 100 feet away or a stop sign that they could clearly see 200 feet away, whatever those parameters were.
And we assume that the roads were designed to the appropriate speed design standards as well, and consistently designed.
Landscaping is another one that is we've witnessed clearly impacts how fast people drive. Is there a tree line that blocked? Again, this is more talking about sight lines than the landscaping itself, but can they clearly see down the road? Do they know what's coming up? Again, just something we don't know for each of these sites.
But anecdotally, going back to kind of the nature of River Falls versus the nature of Woodbury, we don't think Woodbury is pretty typical suburban, very clear, open sight lines for the most part. So that kind of backs up our conclusions, we believe, just what we know of the cities.
And right along those lines, our last caveat that we'll mention is just parking. This is very similar to the landscaping, how it can affect your sight lines. It can also inherently squeeze the width of a road if you have a lot of parking on there. If you have a 36-foot road, but there's parking on both sides, that quickly gets you down into your close spacing on the lanes going each way. People will slow down because of it.
Yes.
So
we've all experienced that.
Yeah, parking can make a big difference. All right, so with that, we are at about 5 minutes to 1. That's really the end of the information we had. Again, we did a quick research, got some data together, wanted to put that out there, so let people see what we had.
So thank you. And in a second, we'll pull over Paul to read off some of your questions. So please throw any questions you have into the chat and we'll kind of quickly run through. We put together a brief report with our findings that goes along with this presentation. We'll be posting it out on Mike on Traffic, those things. Feel free to shoot me an email if you'd like that PDF of this study. Yeah, happy to help. And then last thought is our upcoming webinar. We'll be talking about the advantages that we're seeing in our engineering practice of doing 48-hour turning movement counts. And I have a lot to say on that. So look for that coming up in mid-October. Look in your email for the invites to that. Hope to see you all back there. So with that, Paul, do you have some questions for us?
Right now, you guys answered the ones that came up. However, Zach made the comment. Zach Willing said in his research, it doesn't matter what the posted speed is, 25 or 30. People will go as fast as they feel comfortable. And maybe you can kind of piggyback off of that a little bit.
Yeah, that gets back to the geometry and why our data kind of intuitively to us is finding a correlation with lane widths. So that comfort could come down to sight lines, design speeds, on-street parking, all those geometry things.
Yeah, and incidentally too, kind of a side note, when we start talking with cities about traffic calming and how they want to slow speeds, that is actually one of the things we'll look at is how we can essentially narrow the road up, whether it is the parking on both sides, whether it's striping. If the road is striped, you stripe 11 foot or 10.5, and that makes people slow down some. The intersection chokers, all these things visually will impact how people drive as it makes them, again, makes them feel a little more enclosed or slow down.
And I'm going to go right into Zach's follow-up question since you brought it up. Do you have any recommendations for traffic calming design manuals?
I think they've hit basically what I just mentioned. I mean, none of those are new.
No,
So I don't know that we have any new recommendations. This is more just confirmation that the items that are in there, they will work. But we're not talking huge. You're not going to drop something 5 miles an hour. But if you implement 1 or 2 of these things that in essence narrow the road, you're going to knock 2 to 3 mile an hour off the 85th percentile.
Yeah, I suggest, Zach, you go to Mike on Traffic and go to the search bar and search traffic calming. Over the years, I've written several blog posts and linked to different resources out there. So yeah, check that out. And if you still have more questions, feel free to email me and we can have a little conversation about that.
Diane asks, for the 2 location study, did local fire codes restrict the amount of parking on the streets? The streets must be 36 feet before on-street parking for both sides of the street, or was that information you didn't get?
We did not get that information.
Yeah, that would go right into the caveats of we don't know where exactly. We know where the sites were. We don't know the characteristics around them.
Is there data on traffic speeds on higher traffic volume situations for a one-way versus two-way? B, the width of traffic lane as opposed to the overall street width, 10-foot lane versus 14-foot lane, for example, or marked bike lanes, road environments to make a psychological slower street?
I know I've seen that data and I believe different NCHRP reports, but I can't cite for you what number of reports those are. So I believe that data has been collected. That does show a correlation with narrower lane widths. Interestingly, also the shoulder needs to be taken into account when you're looking at 2-lane roads. What that shoulder is made out of and how wide it is also impacts safety and speeds.
Before I get to the next question, I just want to give a 2-minute warning here. I know some of you got to get back to work and lunch, but we'll continue to answer questions. Do you know how long the 25 mile per hour statutory has been in effect? Has it been a long time or is it more recent?
For Wisconsin, I'm pretty sure that's been in effect
Long time.
a long time.
Yeah, much more than 15 years.
Yeah, as far as we know, that's what they came up with originally.
Yeah, I believe that 25 and 30, Wisconsin versus Minnesota, is certainly both longer than 15 years, and wouldn't surprise me if each of them is 70, 80 years.
Brett's making a comment here that they're in Portland, where the speed was just reduced to 20 miles per hour, and they don't have any data on that yet.
We would love to see it.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, that'd be great to if you're collecting it. That would be really interesting to add that in. And just see where that comes out.
Yeah, and it just throw it in based on Wisconsin versus Minnesota. I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't have an impact without changing the physical environment, just changing the statute. This small sample size would indicate it's not going to really impact.
Unless they're doing heavy enforcement.
The concept of prima facie speed should be in effect at the width of the road decreases. You guys know about that?
I know what he means, but that's a difficult one to enforce, and I think that leaves to a lot of judgment in the hands of the police officer, and would be a difficult thing, at least from. I'm not a lawyer, but I think that would be a very difficult thing to implement.
Yeah, just leave it at that.
Victor, in St. Paul, there are intersections, traffic circles, and some of the residential streets. Are these cost effective, or this merely move the traffic to other streets?
We have found that it's very situational because yes, you will divert some traffic over to parallel routes, but they do have a positive impact of reducing
They will slow,
speeds.
they will slow people down. They have to slow down to move through the intersection. So it is a way to slow them, but just like you mentioned in your question, you have to take into account those other impacts.
All right, I suspect drivers behave differently based upon their perception of the functional class on the road. Notice your River Falls volumes were higher and so were speeds. Notice how motorists drive more slowly and will stop very politely on local streets a block either way from Lindale. But on Lindale, barring congestion, stopping for peds is next to unheard of. And I bet speeds are higher. Widths, though, are not much different. It seems to me speeds were driven by factors other than signs. Out there, I think there's more to it than width. At least that's what Rich wanted to comment upon getting into the conversation.
I think contextually that's true. I will say with our data, all of these streets are classified as local streets, and Lindale Avenue is a minor arterial to talk about the local. So the feel and design of those roads is significantly different.
So other than that, Rich wants to thank you guys.
Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, Rich.
And Zach just wanted to know if you guys were interested. The FHWA study kind of goes along with this study, and it's entitled The Effects of Raising and Lowering Speed Limits on Selected Roadway Sections.
Thanks, Zachary. I flipped through that a little bit, and I don't know, at least it didn't jump out at me that they really dove into the widths of the roadway. They talked about lane configurations, if I'm remembering right, but not the actual width, curb to curb. But I'd love you to throw in the chat box if I'm wrong on that.
Okay, we've gone over a little bit here, so we're at the 103.
Yeah.
We got our Q&As through, so thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah, and lastly, please, if you have some speed data you could share with us, we would love to make this more robust, this analysis, and would love to do a follow-up in 6 to 12 months, especially if our conclusions change. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, we appreciate everybody hanging with us, and we hope to see you next month. I'll throw it up on the screen again. And yeah, again, thanks for joining us.
Last one, Diane asked spot speeds versus tubes to collect data. We prefer tubes because you can get a much larger sample size, and at least it's consistent. Spot speeds the person doing it can impact the results. So spot speed gives a lot more variability in our opinion and a much smaller sample size, where we would rather see a week's worth of data, so we could see trends throughout the course of the day in different traffic volume conditions.
All right, thank you, everyone.
All right, we're signing off. Thanks again.